Looks like it's working.
I have everything up on my other streams on my other screen, so I'm going to rely on my laptop down here below me to check that the stream is going okay. And it looks like it is. That's cool. I have my stream chat set to subscriber only right now, but I might change that if need be. But it shouldn't be a big deal. Welcome to anybody who's already here. I don't think there is anyone, but we will see. Where are we? I think there's. No, I think we're good. Don't think there's anything too much to alter here, so I think we're all set. So I guess while we're just waiting for some people to stream in, fill me in on how all these tournaments have been going lately that you've been playing. I know you've been out there in the mix.
Yeah. Well, for the most part, good. I final tabled 2 out of the 3 tournaments I played, but it was such a small field that I didn't cash in them, which was a
Mm-hmm.
little annoying. And then hey Malicious, how are you? Hey Trev. What's up, Pat? And but then I ended up in a somewhat deep run in the main event, so that was good. And then I cashed.
Cool.
I like laddered up 2 ladders and cashed that, so that went well.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I mean, at least getting a couple ladders is always gratifying, right? When you have you're
It
kind of
was.
in that point where you're forced to ladder up a little bit, but at least you actually get the ladders, you know?
Exactly. Yep. So I did that, and so it went well. It went well, and it was a fun trip. So yeah, I felt good about the poker. There was a little bit of an interesting spot I got myself into in the main event on day one, which remind me to talk to you about at some point. I don't know if
Okay.
I need to get the specifics of the hand, so I don't
Okay.
think I would. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's probably, if you don't have the specifics of the hand, we'll wait until you have them. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
because
happy to
the
back up whenever.
stack sizes is why it mattered. The stack sizes really mattered in this hand, and I kind
Oh,
of
sure.
yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, no worries. Well, for anybody who's out there in the chat, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel or Ash's channel, we're live on both channels right now. So if you have subscribed to Ash but not me, go subscribe to me. If you subscribe to me but not Ash, go subscribe to Ash. That's the whole point of this. Got,
yes,
what do they call it? Cross pollinating audiences or something,
yeah,
right? Something like
yeah.
that. I don't know. You probably know more about the marketing stuff than me, but anyway, guys. Oh, I forgot to do the YouTube thing where you have to say hit the like button. Make sure you hit the like
Oh
button,
yes,
share with your friends, all that stuff. I always forget to do that stuff, but they tell me it makes a difference, so I'll try to remember to say that a couple times. But
yeah,
yeah,
it does. It does.
so we're gonna go today. We're gonna go talk about some concepts related to exploits, and I think this is an idea that there's a ton of conversation about it. People talk about exploits in all kinds of different ways, but I don't know if they for sure always have like a clear sense of what exactly they're talking about, right? Like I think it quite often gets talked about in a way that we're sort of it is very abstract, but it's also like not particularly it doesn't easily give us a clear idea of this is what we're actually supposed to do differently to exploit certain players. So what I want to start with is going through some pretty general ideas, some sort of overviews of the concepts that I think are most important for figuring out exploits. And then I have some different stuff that relates to pre-flop, flop and turn, and then river, and just kind of an overall perspective of these different portions of the game tree, basically. So before I kind of go into the explanation, I suppose, talk me through a little bit, like in game right now, how you think about exploits and these ideas, and also what kind of made you feel like this was an area or a topic that you thought would be useful, because I know you mentioned that when we talked about this originally.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. Also, I was going to ask you if you could zoom in when you're talking about it. So
Yeah,
now
I'm
it's
gonna
very
do
clear on the
this.
screen now. So
Yeah,
perfect. It
okay,
looks good. Okay.
cool.
That
All
was the
right.
only thing I was concerned about.
Yeah,
Awesome.
no,
Okay.
Discord keeps like if I select away from Discord, it blanks out the screen. So I'm gonna keep Discord on top, but I'm gonna zoom in on the chart when I'm talking about certain things. So
Perfect. Okay,
yeah.
looks good. Yeah, so basically like I just kind of want to understand what I might be missing in
Mm-hmm.
terms of finding spots because
Yeah.
when I'm in a tournament, no one, like I was telling you, no one wants to blind down to 10 bigs, have to shove and bust or whatever. And so it's
Hmm.
like, I'll be sitting there and I write down every single hand I was dealt. And if I bust the tournament and I'm like, wait, how did I bust this? Could I have found a different spot? Could I have found better spots? How can I gain chips? Ultimately, I guess my question is, how do I accumulate chips in a tournament, right? Which is everyone's struggle, but for me, it comes down to specific examples of like, let's just say the cutoff opens and he's like a really weak rec player. Should I just take any hand on the button if I'm like dwindling down and I need to pick this spot? Should I three bet it here? Like, am I not doing enough, I guess?
Hmm.
Because I know a lot of things do depend on card distribution, but it's like I don't want to miss any spots exploitatively. And I feel like
Right.
I don't know how far out to branch out before getting, okay, actually, that was a punt. That was insanely out of line,
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
where's that line? And then what do I think about? So that's really where I'm coming from. And like, how do I accumulate chips? But further, what spots am I missing that I
Right.
could have been taking and I didn't? So
Yeah, yeah, totally get it. I think that this is a common thing for people to think about, a common thing for people to worry about to some degree. And above all, what it often comes down to is there's also like a mindset aspect of it, right? Where the the feeling of being sort of card dead or spot dead in a tournament is so frustrating that it can lead us to feel like there's a way to kind of force a profitable spot, right? It can make
right.
us feel like, oh, there's a way to take a situation where we get dealt a trashy hand and we're just gonna like find a way to make it make money, right? Now
Right.
the tricky part of that, of course, is that doing that and trying to force the action quite often is a bigger mistake than just letting the spot go, right? Because ultimately, if they are, if they're deviating to some degree, yeah, there's going to be spots you can pick up that don't, that are a little bit outside the box. But in most cases, the way I think it's helpful to look at it is that the further into the game tree you get, the more scope you have to go way off base, right? So when you're in the early stages, when you're pre-flop, the problem is that in the pre-flop phase of a hand, the governing factor of about so many things is the equity of different hands, right? There are
Right.
so many different hands that have decent equity. There are very very few hands that are super strong equity, but there are also a bunch of hands that have bad enough equity that no matter what mistake your opponent's making, there's just no justification for like trying to three bet seven deuce off in some random spot, right? Um,
Right.
and conversely, there's some boundaries. There's some situations where as long as we have a hand that has a certain kind of a property, we can justify expanding the range, but we have to have a starting point of where we're leading off from. And most of the time, that starts with understanding the hands that are on the borderline and expanding from there, right? So having like a progression of these are the hands that are in the normal range. These are the hands that are kind of in the expanded version of this range. And then there are quite a lot of situations where if I get dealt a hand that's so far outside of range that it's not even within the kind of expanded version of that range, there's just nothing I can do in a pre-flop spot. But then there are situations where by the time you get to the river, there are some spots where you get to the river and your opponent's already accumulated 3 or 4 different mistakes they've made over the course of that hand. And by the time you get to the river, you basically can just bluff every single bluff candidate because they just don't have enough good hands or they don't have enough calls. And so I think tournament players tend to think too much about exploits early on in the hand and not enough about exploits later on in the hand. Because the biggest mistakes exist on the river, and you can really create a lot of interesting and fun strategies on rivers if you have a good idea of how these exploits function. But there's
Hmm.
only so much you can really do pre-flop because people just get dealt good hands. And especially when there's a lot of players behind you, they just get dealt good hands. When you're under the gun one, it doesn't matter how loose the under the gun player is. You still have 7 players left to act behind you, and there's very, very little you can do, right? So the way I like to look at things and frame things out is to take this big picture approach and in particular focus on, what are the fundamental things that we're looking out for when it comes to trying to identify mistakes, trying to identify exploits, right? So this graphic that I have here that I put together, this tool is called Lucidchart. It's really cool. It allows you to like design all these kinds of visual graphics and stuff. So I've been playing around with it lately. The 4 major exploits that exist can really be boiled down to these 4 things: overfolding, overbluffing, underbluffing, and underfolding. And you'll notice that it's all relating to bluffing frequencies and folding frequencies, because these are the things that, when it comes to optimal ranges, optimal strategy, we can identify, particularly in very simple river spots. We do know what the optimal frequency is to be calling, the optimal frequency to be folding, because these things very directly influence whether bluffs are going to make money or not. So according to different parameters here, according to the different weaknesses that a player might have, we can start to put them in different categories, right? We can start to say, okay, a player who's over bluffing and over folding, so they're folding a lot when you play aggressively against them, but they're also finding a bunch of weird bluffs. That's going to be like the more aggressive recreational player, but that's a pretty rare type, right? That's not going to happen a lot. Then you've got probably by far the most common type, which is the players who are over folding, but also under bluffing, in that they are not finding bluffs when they get there into the bluffing spots. They're risk averse in general. And when they do face a bet, they're folding too much, right? And that's your average, passive, tight recreational player. Then you've got the more extreme examples where you've got the players who are under bluffing, but also under folding, which is like the super passive players who just don't fold rivers at all. And then we've got the players who are both under folding and over bluffing, which are just the whales. They're just the players who are like, you just don't have a fold button, just clicking buttons randomly, right? So these are the 4 most extreme categories. And if you want to look at this square grid, they're going to be on the 4 corners, right? The most extreme versions of these would be the 4 corners of that grid. But then right in the middle, when we've got, pretty appropriate frequencies in all of these areas, we've got a kind of GTO strategy. And I think a useful concept to have in mind is, when you're thinking about a specific opponent in particular, try to have an idea in mind of where on this graphic do they sit, right? Which corner are they more likely to be close to? Maybe they're not necessarily, like, maybe we don't necessarily know like how much folding they're doing, but we've kind of seen them show down a couple of hands that they should have bluffed, but they didn't bluff. And so maybe we're pretty confident they're under bluffing. And so maybe they would be like in the top right-ish, but like not completely, and we're not really sure. But of course, if they're a pro, if they are, much more on the territory where we're confident about the type of tendencies they're going to exhibit, then they're going to probably be somewhere close to the middle of this graphic, right? Now, in an ideal world, I'd be able to draw a version of this that had a nice little gradient coming out from the middle to show that there's like a real sliding scale to all of it. But I didn't have the artistic skills to do that yet, but I'll figure that out at some point. But the general idea here is we can actually categorize players quite well using these ideas, because these are essentially the only 4 weaknesses that actually exist, right? Every time we have a player that we can identify in terms of this player's a fish, this player's making a bunch of mistakes, every mistake that they make can be categorized into one of these 4 things. And 2 of them relate to when they're facing aggression, and 2 of them are when they are the aggressor themselves. One way or another, everything comes down to something like this. Does that make sense? You following this so far?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in terms of the players that you're mostly up against, like if we take the most recent events as an example, what categories do you find yourself running into most often here?
More the average passive rec and extremely passive, and then also a little bit of whales in there.
Sure. Yeah. I think the aggro recs that are like on the overfolding and overbluffing side are a bit less common. One thing that is probably kind of an interesting one to think about is that a lot of pros will actually fall into the top left if they understand how to play exploitatively. So a pro that's playing well exploitatively against an average passive rec, because they know that this player is going to be underbluffing and overfolding, their response to that player is to overfold because that player is underbluffing, and to overbluff because that player is overfolding, right? So the top left square is the exploitative response to the top right square, basically. And then if you look at the others, well, for, let's say, for example, the player that is underbluffing and underfolding. So the bottom right player, the extremely passive fish. What do you think would be the exploitative response for that one?
To just be very aggressive.
Well, if they're underbluffing, what's our response to underbluffing going to be?
Overfolding.
Yep. And if they're underfolding, are we going to overbluff or underbluff?
Overbluff.
If they're underfolding?
Oh, underfolding. Then we're not going to bluff.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, exactly. So in fact, the top right square is the exploit for the bottom right square, right? And this is kind of how those average passive recs actually survive in tournaments. It's how they don't get crushed. It's because the extremely passive fish that not only underbluff but also underfold, they're paying off the average passive rec, right? So top left is the exploit for top right. Top right is the exploit for bottom right. What's the exploit for bottom left? The player who underfolds and also overbluffs.
Underbluffs. The aggro rec.
Well, if they're overbluffing, what's the exploit for that?
If they're overbluffing, we're gonna underfold.
Yep. And if they are underfolding, what are we gonna do?
If they're not folding, we're gonna underbluff.
Yeah. So in fact, the exploit for the whale is bottom right, right?
Bottom
it's
right,
the extremely passive fish. And you can see there's kind of a cycle coming, there's kind of a cycle building, right? The top left is the exploit for top right. Top right is the exploit for bottom right. Bottom left is the exploit, bottom right is the exploit for bottom left. So the last one that's left, the player who's overfolding, but also overbluffing, which might be, a pro in some cases, what's the exploit for them?
The passive rec?
Well, if they are overbluffing, what's our response?
Underfolding, so...
Yep. And if they are overfolding, what's our response?
Overbluffing?
Yep. So in fact, bottom left is the exploit for top left. So it is, it's a complete cycle, right? That's kind of what I was leading to. It's really, each one is the exploit for the next one, right? So in general, each of these weaknesses does have something that they're giving up and something that they are gaining from other players. And because of the natural human risk aversion that exists, top right is the most common weakness. Top right, average passive rec, a big chunk of most tournament fields consists of those types of players. But if we can kind of understand the general dynamics here of how these weaknesses interact with each other, each one of them has its benefits against a certain type of player. Playing like a huge fish, an extremely passive fish, might actually make sense if your opponent is playing a certain way. If your opponent is just or just they're over bluffing, and they're underfolding, so you don't have to really bluff. You don't have to think too much about the bluffing candidates because they're not folding, so you just get paid off when you have it. And then when they're playing aggressively, they're just wildly over bluffing, so you just don't fold your bluff catches. And in the end, you're kind of playing like a fish by doing that, but you're exploiting the heck out of them, right? So, like Dane says in the chat here on my channel, shout out Dane, my student. He says the exploit EV flows counterclockwise, and that's exactly what it is, right? I could have I could have put the graphic together in the inverse way. Like there's no reason why overfolding and overbluffing have to be top left, but it does flow counterclockwise according to this version of the graphic, basically. So this is kind of the big picture of how different player types end up exploiting each other. And of course, our goal is to keep an eye out for which players fall into different categories, and to recognize that as soon as there's any kind of deviation from optimal that exists, or any kind of significant deviation from optimal, then there is some kind of an exploitative strategy that develops as a response to that. And the question in any case is going to be, how do we actually build those strategies? How do we arrive at those strategies? How do we figure out what they are? And so on. So this is where I now have to shift the graphic over a little bit to talk about preflop. Where are we? How exploits work. Okay, oops, I didn't mean to do that. You guys are going to see a black screen for a second. But, okay, this is preflop right here. Okay, that's probably enough. I think you can kind of see all of it there. Cool. So this is how we want to think about preflop. And a lot of the simple things about preflop, when it comes to just basic opening ranges, they're actually, people tend to think about, how do I open wider? Like, what are the spots to open wider? Some of this stuff is a little bit counterintuitive to the way people tend to think about it, but some of it is actually quite obvious. And the first thing that's quite obvious is the only tendencies that matter when we're thinking about exploiting preflop in a basic raise first in kind of a sense are the tendencies of the players left to act, right? The tendencies of anybody who's not left to act, they don't matter. So the good news about that is that the later the position we're in, the more opportunity we have to adapt based on tendencies of players left to act, because we only have 2 players that we have to figure out instead of a whole 7 or 8, right? Yeah. So in a lot of cases, when we're under the gun, when we're in early position, it's really hard to find too many situations where we can kind of expand our range or open wider, unless the entire table is exhibiting the same kind of weakness, right? Which is pretty rare. Most of the time, it kind of cancels itself out. Like there might be one really loose fish, but there's also a couple of tight players and it kind of evens out, right? But if there is a super loose table in general, super tight table in general, some things are going to start to change. But broadly speaking, the first question is, what are the tendencies of players left to act? And if they're overfolding, the response is fairly simple. It's to open wider than GTO and or a smaller sizing. Now, a smaller sizing than GTO in some spots isn't really possible because sometimes we're just opening a min raise. Right. So that would just mean if they're overfolding, we just open wider and wider, right? There might be quite a lot of situations where if we're on the button and, they're supposed to be defending, big blind is supposed to be defending 60% of hands, they're actually defending 30%. Well, opening 80% of hands could be completely fine, right? Opening any 2 cards would probably be completely fine in that circumstance. So yeah. It does allow us specifically to target an overfold quite easily, because all that really happens when they overfold is some of their hands that are supposed to realize equity by either seeing a flop against us or 3-betting or something like that, they're not doing that, right? Mm-hmm. And in particular, the most important player to keep an eye on here is the player in the big blind, because in any given circumstance, the most likely player for you to be up against is the big blind, right? There's never going to be anybody that's more likely to play the hand than the big blind. And if the big blind is overfolding, you get to pick up that pot way more often. And the good thing is if the big blind is underfolding, that doesn't even really hurt you that much because they still have to play all that weak range out of position. So really the big blind being a good player, like actually knowing what to do post-flop, is the only thing that can really start to make us a bit more concerned about that, right? If the big blind's tight or loose, one way or the other, they end up getting punished. Now, on the flip side, we have what happens if they're underfolding. And this, I think, is where people get really tripped up. People get really caught up thinking like, oh, these guys are just flatting super wide. These guys are, playing way too many hands. And that does happen. It's certainly a real thing. But there is a big difference between a table that is flatting too much and a table that's three betting too much. And in
Yeah.
particular, it's really hard for the whole table to be three betting too much because the amount that you're supposed to three bet is quite a lot, and most people don't three bet that much. So
Right.
if you did run into a table that was three betting too much, then the answer would be to open a bit tighter than GTO and to size down even further beyond what you currently are, because you don't need to try so hard to get chips in the pot if they're doing it for you, right? But of course, that situation's pretty rare. And now we get to the interesting question, which is if they're flatting too much, the next part of the equation is, are they three betting tighter or looser? Because if they're flatting too much, but they're also three betting a lot, then that means we are still going to face quite a lot of three bets. So we still have to be cautious about defending our opening range against the three bets.
Mm-hmm.
So we basically just stick to GTO open range and sizing. There's not a lot of room to adapt if our opponents are still three betting a lot, but or they're also flatting more, right? So basically the three bet frequency matters a lot more. And then on the flip side, if they are three betting tighter, that's where we have a little bit of incentive to, first of all, open slightly tighter than GTO, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're opening a few of those hands that are going to struggle to realize equity, maybe some of the offsuit stuff. Those hands start to drop out a little bit, and we open a little bit bigger, just simply because we have more of an incentive to open kind of a value-heavy range, take advantage of all the money that they're putting into the pot passively. And we are going to play multi-way more often, but that simply requires us to have a marginally tighter range and a bit more of an equity-driven range in that regard. And that's going to just really allow us to play a lot of really good multi-way situations where your opponents are going to have trashy ranges, they're going to have wide ranges, they're not going to be able to flop enough equity. And the bottom line there when it comes to multi-way pre-flop spots is any range that is any range that is essentially too wide and full of a bunch of weak hands is not a range that we have to be afraid of, right? The only thing that our opponents are doing by flatting wider than they should, flatting trashy hands in spots where they shouldn't, is making life harder on themselves. It's just that multi-way play, starts to get a bit tricky when that does happen. But generally, when it comes to opening ranges, there are quite a few situations where we can identify overfolds. There are also some of these situations where we're going to get underfolds, but there's definitely a difference between an underfolding table that is just like flat, 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 everything goes multi-way, or an underfolding table where everybody's just super three bet happy. Does that make sense?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. And then of course we have in the middle, we have the GTO, like we don't know what the table's like, table's playing pretty well, like that, we just open a GTO range and it's, everything gets kind of simpler from there. So This is a lot of the open raising stuff. And the good thing is a lot of this actually still works with three bets as well, right? I haven't filled out a specific kind of a different graphic here for preflop three betting because the principles are still basically the same. So if you look at, let's say, what happens on the left side of this graphic with the overfolding circumstance, right? If our opponent is overfolding to three bets, that's going to lead us to three bet wider than GTO, right? First of all, we can three bet wider. And we also don't have to three bet quite as big because if we're getting an overfold, then our opponent basically is going to become a bit more inelastic, right? They're just either folding or they're continuing. And instead of going, 3x the open, we might go 2.5 or 2.7 or something like that. So that's the kind of situation that we're looking for. We're looking to be able to identify opponents who are potentially going to overfold to three bets. And when we do that, we can actually use smaller sizings. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes total sense. Yeah.
Okay. And then on the flip side, how would you think it would work when we're facing people who are not folding enough against 3-bets? What would you kind of piece together from what we've just talked about?
Make them a little larger and have more value heavy 3-bets, so we
Mm-hmm.
just own them.
Kind of, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, it really comes down to this the same principle where it's, are they 4-betting tighter than GTO or not, right? They might be
right.
underfolding to the 3-bet, but if they're underfolding to the 3-bet, they're also finding some good 4-bet bluffs and stuff like that, so they're just generally pretty aggro pre-flop. We kind of have to stick a bit closer to GTO because we still need to be able to have hands that can defend against that 4-bet, right? But
Yeah.
if they're dramatically under 4-betting, so they're just like, they don't fold to 3-bets, but they also don't 4-bet bluff, then we can 3-bet a bit tighter, but also a bit more linear and a bit thinner for value. And we can just 3-bet stuff like, King Jack suited is just like a pure value 3-bet now, because
Yeah.
if we get 4-bet, we just auto fold, and we get 4-bet so
Right.
rarely that we don't even have to care, right? So
Right.
we become more linear, and our sizing kind of goes up to just get money in the pot against a range that's playing passively, basically, right?
Yeah, and I was thinking about the first person you said, the one that just overfolds to 3-bets, and you said
Yeah,
we can go smaller. I find that as a great strategy too when like you're in a tournament where average stack is very low, and so
yeah,
you can kind of get away with murder because they're so inelastic that the very fact that you 3-bet is enough. Like
mm-hmm.
it is almost like, and then they don't have any concept of how many big blinds I'm putting in. So let's just say I made it like 67,000. Well, they're thinking
Mm-hmm.
of the amount a lot of the
Yes,
times these rec play they're not thinking, "Oh, she only min clicked it barely or whatever."
right,
And so you can kind of get away with murder against those players
right,
as well. Cuz
yeah.
I do that often, especially cuz like I could 3-bet off like something like 16 bigs or something. Like
Yeah,
just 'cause, yeah, so
yeah, that is going to happen. That's very much a real thing. So, question in my chat says, "And you at 20, how do you mix it if there's a mix with regs and loose fishes?" So, in those circumstances, like when you're dealing with like a mix of players behind, you just really don't have a lot of option other than to stick with a GTO strategy or close to it. The one thing that I would say though is that it's important to always be aware of where your EV is coming from. So if you are in an environment where there's a lot of fish, and this is MTT stuff, but it also actually applies in cash games as well. The general idea though with these the mixed environments is that if the bulk of your EV is going to come from the fish, which it is in any situation, like if there's fish and regs, like you're not winning that much money from the regs, you're winning most of your money from the fish, then it might be completely fine to just focus on a strategy that takes advantage of the fish more effectively and just not care that much about the regs exploiting you, because the priority is just to get the money off the fish, right? And that's going to kind of be an important part of it. So I knew it says, if I have loose fishes in blinds and I'm button, should I not open wider? You should, but it should be with hands that can realize equity well against a wide range, right? If you're opening stuff like offsuit trashy stuff like king deuce off that just benefits from getting a lot of folds, there are going to be some instances where some hands like that might, when you flop top pair, you're going to be able to get a lot more value, but there's also going to be a lot of instances where you're not going to have the fold equity that you need to against a fish, right? So you want to make sure that you do open wider, but you open with hands that you kind of understand how you're going to play those spots post flop. And then of course you also have to take into account stack size. Like if you're pretty shallow, then the fact that you have position across multiple streets doesn't actually matter that much. So you do want to be mindful of that as well. Thanks, Inuit. No worries. So this is the framework, in terms of how we're approaching pre-flop. And obviously, there's variations within this, but there's also a couple other things that we can kind of keep in mind that if we look at these situations where we're deviating, like if we're looking at exploiting an overfold, for example, in a circumstance like that, because we're specifically targeting an overfold, it's more valuable for us to have blockers to the continues because we're not going to have that much need to play post flop. So in the end, post flop playability and equity is not going to be particularly important. And then conversely, if we are exploiting an underfold, then when we do 3-bet or when we do open, we're going to need to have more playability, because that underfold that is going to force us to play post flop more often and make it harder for us to realize equity is going to require us to, be able to have more playability, be able to have hands that are suited, hands that have more flexibility post flop. So there's two different directions there, and the hands that we choose can be different based on which type of exploit we're actually making. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Cool.
when I look at pre-flop, like I'm like, okay, I'm pretty much doing all of this. So
Yeah.
what else am I missing, right? And then it's like I think a lot of my EV that is missed or mistakes I'm making, honestly, is probably getting myself in these spots and then making mistakes post, honestly.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think what's kind of good about that, it's actually funny that it's funny that you used to work with Fausto, because I had the same conversation with Fausto. I had this conversation with Fausto where it was like, if you take an exploitative line against someone on an earlier street and then they do the opposite of the thing that you're expecting. So for example, if you're exploiting an overfold on the earlier street and then they don't fold, you have to then back off of the exploit, right? Like you have to recognize that you 3-bet a wider range, they
Right.
called with a tighter range, and
Right.
that means that generally you're gonna have to slow down a lot, right? And
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
then the flip side is also true, which is that it's not so much that you're gonna have to slow down when you exploit an underfold. If anything, it's the inverse. They underfolded pre-flop, which means that you went more value heavy, but then when they continue to the flop, they now have too wide of a range. And we're going to get to that in a second. So this is a good segue into the post-flop part. They have too wide of a range, and you have kind of a tight range. So you get to play that range a lot more aggressively post, because you have a much more equity-driven linear pre-flop range, and they have too many trashy hands. So the flip side is true here, except we just have to understand how those adaptations relate to each other, right? So I'm going to just quickly switch over and move the graphic around a little bit and show you the post-flop part. So this is kind of for flops and turns, and there it is.
You might have to zoom in on a specific part you're talking about, because
Oh,
I think
okay.
it's
Is it a
on my
little bit
screen anyway.
small?
It's pretty, yeah.
Okay, let's maybe I can just, you know what? Maybe I can just make the text bigger. Let's try that. Let's make it. Let's just do that. Okay, that might be good. Okay.
That worked.
Okay, that worked.
That
Okay, good.
worked.
Well,
Yeah.
now I can't see it properly on my screen. One sec. Uh, okay, there we go.
Nice.
All right. So
That's for way better. Yeah.
yeah, cool. All right. So the I already kind of touched on this a little bit, but as you can see, the main thing about flop and turn when it comes to villain being able to potentially make, or villain making adaptations that they maybe shouldn't have made, or villain playing further away from GTO on the earlier street, right? The important thing that's going to dictate our strategies as we go through flop, as we go through turn, is what's the actual range that you're up against, right? So that means, are we up against a wider range? Are we up against a tighter range? And how is that going to relate to the range that we're supposed to be up against? Because there are various different types of ranges that can, various different ways that villains' range can be different. And a lot of them come down to it's either wider or it's tighter than it should be. But some of them come down to it's either more capped or less capped than it should be. And that's quite an important thing as well. So if we go from the left to the right, if our opponent's range is tighter than GTO and they have fewer weak hands, so they don't have as much that is, going to just have a trivial check fold on the flop. They don't have as many, situations where they're going to flop no equity and so on. Then that's going to mean that on the next street, our value range is going to tighten and our strategy is going to become a lot more polar overall. So when we do 3-bet with a blocker hand to exploit an overfold pre-flop, for example, we then are going to do more checking on the flop, And when we do bet, it's going to be a bit more polar, and it's not just going to be, we're just going to range bet, because if we try to range bet the flop against a tight range, they're just not going to fold, right? There's just not a lot of flops that they're going to fold. And this is something that, like I said, I had this conversation with Fausto where he was doing a lot of like 3-betting exploitatively and then like range betting against a tight range, and they just never fold. And it's, you don't have to bet the flop. Like, just because you 3-bet pre doesn't mean you have to range bet the flop, And quite
And
often,
also with that range bet, it's generally going to be a small size anyway, so it's almost serves like as a check kind of anyway. Is
well,
that
no, well, what I'm saying is that we're doing less range betting.
okay.
If we're exploiting pre-flop, if we 3-bet wider because they're going to overfold and then they don't fold, the range bet on the flop becomes less effective, because our range is wider and it's weaker, and their range is stronger. So we're going to do more flop checking, and we're also going to do more, polarized larger betting on flops, because we're targeting that middle range that they have, and there's fewer weak hands in there for us to just make them fold to a small bet. But
Yeah.
on the flip side, on the right hand side here, you can't fully see it there because it cut it off when I moved the sizing, but if our opponent has more weak hands than they're supposed to, so they underfolded the previous street, then, we have a more linear range. We have a range that is heavier on equity. So it's actually going to be more and more comfortable for us to just range bet an even greater variety of flops, because we have an even more value heavy range and they have a super weak range. So even some of the flops that would normally be really good for their range and kind of bad for us, their range is now so wide that all flops are good for us, right? Like, they're even like a flop that's like 3 low cards in a 3-bet pot. Like, if they have too many hands, there's just only so many good hands they can have, right? They might have all the 2 pairs and sets and straights on a certain board, but it's just not that easy to make those hands, because if your range gets wider, you have a bunch of trash as well as a bunch of hands that are strong on those boards. So boards that would not normally be range bet boards become range bet boards, and the efficiency of a range bet goes up. Small bets become much more effective against really weak ranges. It's the same reason why we range bet much more often against the big blind than we do against the small blind. If the small blind calls, they don't have as many trash hands. But if the big blind calls, they have all kinds of trash, so we range bet quite a lot. So
And
go ahead.
would it be exploitative too to say, like, against the first example we were talking about, to bet larger because they're also going to be more likely to fold on later streets, so we can actually get them to put more chips in the pot before they fold, like exploitatively?
I would say try not to go too far down the rabbit hole of predicting their tendencies on later streets, and focus more on their tendencies on this street. Because usually what's going to happen is there's going to be like a cadence to it, where if they overfold one street, they're going to underfold the next street, and then they're going to overfold the street after that, and then they're going to underfold the street after that. So quite often what will end up happening is, if they overfold pre, they'll also overfold the turn, but they'll underfold the flop and the river. And so it's quite difficult to plan out your strategy in that much detail, because of just how many different runouts there are. So I think where a lot of people go wrong with exploits is they try to predict the tendency they expect their opponent to have on future streets, instead of focusing on maybe the tendency that you expect them to have on this street, but also the tendency that they already had on the previous street. Because in this case, the fact that if they overfolded pre-flop to your 3-bet, or if they overfolded the big blind to your open raise or something like that, that already has a big impact on your strategy, because you're up against a tighter range than you normally would be. And that immediately means your strategy has to change. So before you even consider what they're doing on this street, you have to consider what they already did on the previous one, which means if they overfolded or if they underfolded the previous street, we already have to make an adaptation based on that, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah. And now, we have other things, such as their range is a bit closer to GTO, but maybe they're more capped. And this is a bit more appropriate for perhaps on the turn, but it does also apply to the flop as well to some degree. So, for example, they never slow play strong hands on the previous street. So good example there is on a lot of dynamic flop textures, like a straight draw and a flush draw on the flop, if it's like 10-8-5, right? Most people just are accustomed to never not raising two pair plus on a flop like that. Like most people are like way too afraid of seeing a bad turn card. So two pair plus will just be like 100% raise every single time on that board. And even though you are supposed to raise a lot with your strong hands, a lot doesn't necessarily mean always. And what that can do is if your opponent is raising all their strong hands, then by the time when they check call and the turn comes a brick, they literally can never have better than one pair, right? Like the 10-8-5 turn offsuit deuce. I mean, outside of specifically 10 deuce, they literally never have better than one pair, right? And maybe eight deuce suited, maybe 5 deuce suited, but like for the most part there, other than a couple of two pairs, if they never slow play anything, they're super capped on the turn. So when that happens, we get to go slightly thinner for value because we don't have to worry as much about getting check raised. Like they're going to have almost no hands that can check raise if they have almost no value hands. So that's kind of nice. And we can also size up, right? We don't have to sweat the possibility of running into value hands if they just don't have any, right? If all their two pair plus raised on the previous street and then the turn comes a brick, like there's no value hands anymore. So who cares about, getting raised? It's not going to happen. So when they're more capped, that's the direction. We can size up, we can bet thinner for value. And of course, because we're sizing up, we're going super polarized. A lot of the time we can use some really big overbets here. And when you see people using just massive overbets at deep stacks, a lot of the time this is what they're kind of cluing into. They're kind of recognizing that the opponent they just always have one pair. They just never have better than one pair. And on some boards, it's like, well, you always have one pair and my range has all the over pairs. So here's a 2.5x pot bet. see what you can do against it. It's like, here's a massive bet. Try defending against it, and then on the flip side, you've also got some of the opposite, right? They might be fairly close to GTO, but they're a bit less capped. So they didn't raise some of the strong hands on the previous street as often as GTO. And I think a really common one where this happens is paired boards, because there's a lot of situations where a high frequency of trips hands are supposed to raise the flop on a paired board. But a lot of players will flop trips and go, ooh, I'm going to be really tricky. I'm just going to trap with all my trips here, right? And they end up having like almost no check raises on a board where they might be supposed to check raise like 25% of their range, right? And in those circumstances, when our opponent is actually less capped than they're supposed to be, like they're supposed to raise a bunch of good hands on the previous street, but they decided to play super trappy for no reason. Now, we actually have to be more cautious. Our sizing goes down a little bit because the threat of being check raised has increased, and our ability to just shovel in a lot of money with our strong hands is slightly decreased as well, because there's more strong hands in our opponent's range. So our betting range doesn't change that much, still contains the right hands, contains the hands that can bet for value, but the sizing that we bet is going to slightly, peel down a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Poker Nerd had a question. When facing a player you've never seen, how long can it take to get a feel for their tendencies?
Good question.
We're always playing with incomplete information. We would have to have a million hands on each player to really,
Yeah,
So.
the way I would look at it is pay very little attention to individual players, but pay a ton of attention to the general player pool in the games that you're in. Because even though it is, most people don't want to kind of admit that this is true, but the reality of poker is that most people play pretty much the same. If you're part of the same kind of demographic of players, like 80% of people, I tend to use the 80-20 rule. Like if you can identify a recreational player, 80% of recreational players play basically the same way. They make basically the same kinds of mistakes. They play the same kinds of fairly ABC approaches in most situations. And then the 20% that are outliers, they're going to play kind of the opposite way, but they're still within that 20%, there's still going to be a lot of consistency. if you look at the way the average whale plays, most whales play the same. Like if you've ever played with whale players, like the guys who are just out there punting, like there's only a few ways to punt, right? Like the plays that players make when they're in that category are generally going to be pretty consistent. And then when you look at pros, like most pros play pretty much the same way because GTO is what it is. You know, most people who are trying to play really well are going to play pretty consistently because there's really only a couple of ways to play really well. So I would say just put a lot of your energy into the overall tendencies of the player pool and a lot less energy into specific tendencies of individual players, unless you happen to actually see showdowns that give you concrete information about this player actually had this exact hand and this is how they played it. Once you see showdowns, you can start adapting, but to be able to adapt without seeing showdowns to individual players, especially in tournaments, you're just never realistically going to spend enough time playing with them to really get a good sample size, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would agree there. So, I think in terms of, you know, the general breakdown here for flop and turn, you know, this is kind of the overall approach that I would take here. We didn't cover the right-hand side too much, but we sort of said sizing decreases. We're able to bet more. Our strategy becomes more linear. We can bluff more, you know, and a big part of this is if our opponent underfolds the flop. Like this is a really great one. If you look at GTO strategies against big bets on the flop, like if we give like a low card board, like 7-4 deuce or something, there's quite a lot of spots where we're supposed to bet really big on those boards. And if you look at a sim and you plug it in that your opponent's going to underfold to that big bet, like they're going to call that bet with hands that shouldn't call, their range is now so weak that you get into so many really good turn spots. Like it actually wants you to bluff more on the flop because you get so many good turn bluffing situations that even a hand like King Queen on 7-3 deuce, like if your opponent is just not folding enough in that circumstance, King Queen almost becomes a value hand because if they're just calling every single straight draw and stuff versus a big bet, well now you're getting called by worse than King High, right? So your range becomes more linear and you start to have more incentive to just grow the pot, just focus on exploiting that underfold and just getting money in the pot because they're gonna fold the later streets so often when they have that trashy range, right? So the last part here is to look at the river itself. So I'm just gonna shift across the graphic right here. Okay, maybe we zoom in a little more. Okay, can you see that okay? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is where exploits actually get somewhat simple, right? We kind of talked a little bit already about tendencies and how they relate to these ideas here. The 4 basic tendencies that exist on the river, this is where, you know, we do have to look at the tendencies that they already exhibited, but we also can start to make slightly better assumptions about overfolds, overbluffs, underfolds, underbluffs, etc. on specific rivers because bottom line is we know all the cards now. We know all the board cards, right? We don't have to deal with 46 different river cards or 47 different river cards. We just have to deal with the exact river that came out. And obviously the exploits here are pretty extreme. There are a lot of situations where we just either call all bluff catches or fold all bluff catches. And there's obviously a lot of situations where we just bluff every potential bluffing candidate and a lot where we don't bluff any of them. And really the hardest thing about this aspect is that there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of like metagame that can influence what our perceptions are about different players at this point. And there's also, you can see big changes sometimes within the span of a short period of time. If a certain player just gets bluffed on the river a couple of times, they just decide, well, I'm not going to fold next time, right? Like they just are like, screw you, I'm not folding a third time to your river bluff. And so quite often I think with rivers, you end up having to like either just stick with like, okay, I'm just going to play an optimal range because that rabbit hole is too deep to go down, or I am going to have to really like try to figure out exactly what kind of level this guy's on. Like, is he like really waiting to desperately catch a bluff, in which case I'm just never going to bluff and I'm just always going to have value? Or is he like, he just caught a bluff and he was wrong, and now the last thing he wants to do is call another river bet with a bluff catcher? in which
Right.
case I'm just going to bluff everything.
Right.
This is the stuff that's like, it's a really, it's kind of an old school, like old timey kind of aspect of poker, really. But it is a super important skill, right? There's no getting around the fact that understanding how people think in these spots is important, but
Yep.
it's obviously really tricky, right? So do you, as it stands right now, do you find yourself actually like thinking in terms of these things when you get to the river, or do you feel like maybe it's not quite fully fleshed out in game yet?
I think for the most part, yeah, I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it definitely needs some fine tuning, and I think sometimes I give myself excuses to do something
Mm-hmm.
when I shouldn't. Like, okay, I know this person, has it showed up to the river with a really tight range, and probably very nutted, but oh, I have a blocker, so I'm just gonna go for it anyway and just get, whatever. So I
Yeah,
think that I need to just kind of really just stick to, like you said, the pull tendencies and what you know about this spot.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question in my chat. Steve says, "Do you guys think that most semi-rec players know the difference between cash game strategy and tournament strategy?" Um, I have an answer to that, but I'm curious what you would say, Ash. Do you think that rec
Well,
players, do you think that most semi-rec players know the difference between cash game strategy and tournament strategy?
semi rec
Yeah,
players,
I guess we'll just
I would
generalize it to rec
I
players,
would say I would say no. There's so many nuances that they severely I don't think so. No, I
Yeah.
see it all the time where they make egregious tournament errors and or like a lot of it's like a lot of bet sizing errors because they're used to cash game sizes and
Yeah.
and not knowing how to play with like a 30 big blind stack. Oh, I see the craziest stuff
Oh,
because
yeah.
I think they just don't understand at all the differences. So yeah, and those are the players honestly we make a lot of money off of in tournaments.
Absolutely, and I think in all honesty, the answer that I would give here is I don't think they know the difference between the two strategies because I don't think they know either of the strategies very well at all. Like I just don't think
Right. Yeah.
they I don't think they have a good idea of what a good cash game strategy is or a good tournament strategy. So it's not that they can't tell the difference between the two, it's that all their ideas about good strategy in both formats are basically wrong because they think that tournaments are all about survival and they think that cash games are all about like speculating and just trying to make a big hand and get paid off, and neither of those things are really true at all, so I
Right.
think that for the most part, if a player is not actively studying pretty consistently, if they're just, even, I mean, semi-rec kind of to me implies that they're like taking the game pretty seriously, like they're almost kind of a reg. And I think that by the time you get to like semi-rec status, you should know a lot about what good strategy looks like in either of those two games that you're playing, and you should be able to tell the difference. I think any player who gets to like semi-rec status, where you're like trying to actually take the game seriously and make money from it, you probably should pick one of the disciplines and not both, because it's really hard to study both and get really good at both. Um,
Yeah.
and you also should recognize that there are certain things about good strategy in each one that are completely different from the other format, and uh, you can't really know what those differences are until you at least know one of the formats really well. But yeah, I think a lot of people, a lot of rec players don't know much about good strategy, and that applies to cash and tournaments. I think generally anybody who's not spending a lot of time studying poker probably doesn't know a ton about what good strategy looks like. So I think there's
Yeah.
still a ton of opportunities out there to put these exploits into practice. I don't know about what your
Agreed.
stance is on that.
Agreed.
Yeah,
100%. I agree.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, poker is it's a game that gets tougher. Take the sorry. I knew it. 20 says take the best cash game players. They'll struggle at MTTs, vice versa. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's like I've had this chip on my shoulder for a decade plus now about this, but cash game players have always said, or back in the day, cash game players used to say, "Oh, tournament poker is not real poker," and cash game players, cash game players do way better in tournaments than tournament players do in cash games. And there
Mm.
might have been a time when that was true, because even some of the best tournament players were just total nits and we had no idea what good strategy looks like. But now,
Right.
if you look at cash game versus tournaments, the best cash game players are struggling tournaments, and the best tournament players are struggling in cash games. Like, there are not many players who are good at both, and the cash game players that do dabble in like the high roller scene, they spend just as much time studying tournaments these days as they do cash games. So there's a big difference between the formats, and I think it's really, really tough these days if you're just starting out in poker to split your time between both and
Yeah.
get good at both. I would certainly recommend to most people to just pick one and kind of stick with that and focus on that based on what you enjoy and what you think your skill set is best suited to, because it's super hard to really study both.
Yeah, and I think cash game players, they have this view of like, oh, it's just shove and get lucky with 10 big blinds. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
even a 10 big blind shove, you're still trying to find pot plus EV spots. Like it's
Yeah,
all strategic. Even having 3 big blinds, it's still strategic. So just
absolutely.
because the variance is significantly higher does not make it less skilled. And I think that
Absolutely.
that's where people have a big misconception about like, oh, it's just getting lucky. Well, no, it's getting making good decisions and also hoping your good hands hold and you suck out every once in a while, which is
Mm-hmm.
like the quote unquote luck factor. But everything you do is also a plus or negative EV decision, and that's what makes a player profitable over time or not. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
I mean, couldn't said it better. The game is still a game of strategy, and the variance is just structured differently. But the
Right.
ultimate reality of all of it is just that there are so many different aspects to both formats. With cash, yeah, you're playing deep stacks all the time, and you've got all these different parts of the tree to learn about. With tournaments, you're playing completely different stack sizes. Like, if you're going to be a tournament player, you have to know how to play 15 big blinds just as well as you play 100 big blinds. And cash
Yep.
game players don't have to worry about that. Cash game players don't care about 15 big blind strategy, right? Cash game players don't care about like what happens when it's like you're on the bubble and it's blind against blind and the chip leader's in the big blind and you're in the small blind and you have 20 bigs and you have to figure out like what's my limping range, how am I going to play when I limp 60% of the deck and then the chip leader checks back 60% of the deck, and now we're playing a limped pot with an SPR of like 5, and both players have 60% of the deck, and like you have to figure out what do I do with my queen 5 offsuit on some king high board. It's like there's so many complicated spots in tournaments, and a lot of cash game players that think that tournaments are like super simple. It's honestly players that think that there is no post flop play below like 25 bigs, when in fact there's like an insane amount of post flop play below 25 bigs. There's not going to be a lot of like flatting and open from the button, sure, and there's not going to be a lot of 3-bet pots, but there's a ton of like somebody opens, you defend the big blind, you have a super wide range, and you have to try to play out of position across 3 streets. There's like so much of that goes on. So I think
Yep.
for the bulk of players that play one format or the other, it ultimately just I don't see players at the top of the game like trashing. The cash game players at the top are not like trashing tournament players anymore, and vice versa. It's just something
Yeah.
that used to happen like 10, 12 years ago. There used to be this real thing about cash game players thinking that cash games were real poker and cash game players were real poker players and tournaments were just push fold, and it just
Yeah. Yep.
it never was that way. It never was, it
No,
never will be. So
no. We were just
yeah,
like way worse back then.
yeah, exactly. Everybody was worse back then. Everybody sucked. Everybody sucked. But now everybody still sucks, but like in
Yeah.
different ways.
Exactly.
We have more info now. We just know how bad we suck. So it's
Yeah, we just know it now. Yeah.
more self awareness. But yeah.
Yes.
All right, so we hit about an hour. I
Yeah,
think
it's
that's
perfect.
probably not a bad spot to kind of wrap it up, unless you have anything else that you wanted to dive into and talk about for the people here.
No, I think that was a really good kind of overview at how to approach each spots. And so I look at this and I'm like, okay, yeah, I was on that line of thinking, of course, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just like diving into it a little bit more and really taking each street. I think that was the
Mm-hmm.
biggest thing I took away today was to look at each street individually and also take into consideration the prior street.
Yeah, I think that's just a big part of it. I think there's so many rabbit holes you can go down trying to like predict your
Yeah.
opponent's frequencies for later streets, and like there's just so many things. Even if you try to predict their post flop frequencies, it's like there's 1755 strategically different flops, and then there's 49 different turns and 48 different rivers. It's like, how are you going to estimate, what their strategies look like across all of those nodes? Like, you don't have to force yourself to do it. It's
That's such a
actually
good point.
it's actually easier in a lot of cases to just think about, okay, well, what did they already do? Like, what mistake did they already make that
Right.
I'm pretty confident already happened? And how do I adjust to that? Because I might be up against a completely different range here than what I'm actually supposed to be against. And that requires building a complete different strategy, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This
No
was
problem.
really, really great. And
Cool.
you went over exactly what I was asking. So that
Well,
was
there you go. I'm
awesome.
happy to do it. If anybody out there in the chat is interested in some coaching, you can find the links under the links in the description on my channel. Obviously, feel free to reach out on Instagram or anywhere else that you can find me. I'm not on Twitter these days because fuck Twitter.
Yeah.
But outside of that, I'm happy to keep in touch with you guys, and I think I'm probably going to do some more streams soon. I'm going to do maybe some like Triton recap streams when these Triton events kick off next week. That might be fun.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Yeah.
So yeah, I might do that. But thank you, Ash, for being part of this and lending your platform. Obviously, I know we got the co-streams going. I don't know how many viewers you've had on your side, but I'm sure it's more than me.
Well, I actually had like 15 to 16 for the longest time. So I think
Okay.
together we got a decent turnout. Yeah.
Yeah,
Albie,
I
thank you.
I
Hey, I didn't know you're here, Albie. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, Major Minor in the chat says I think I'll get some coaching. Happy to help. Drop me a message on Instagram or something, and we can get it sorted out. Looks like we might have actually got like pretty much the same amount of viewers. Like, because I have
I
like
think we did.
I
Yeah.
have 14 concurrents. Like, I'm surprised because you have
Yeah.
like 10 times the amount of YouTube subscribers that I do. So I was like expecting you'd get 10 times the amount of viewers, but I guess not. But
No,
anyway,
that's great.
thank you everybody for being here. Appreciate it. I think we're gonna wrap it up, but I'm sure we'll do some more of this at some point soon, and we'll get some more concepts put together for the people.
Yeah. Thank you guys. I'm going to end stream and
Yeah, me
thanks for
too.
joining us.
Yeah, see ya. Bye.
All right. Ended it. Cool. Thank you so much, Matt. That was great.
No problem. Let me just make sure I can actually stop.